In the drawing rooms of Victorian Britain, beauty was measured not only in gowns of silk or elaborate hairstyles, but in the shape of the body itself. For women of the 19th century, the corset was more than an undergarment. It was a symbol of elegance, respectability, and the ideals of the age. Tightly laced, it shaped the waist, lifted the bust, and created the silhouette that society admired, a body sculpted into an image of refinement. But the corset was also debated, criticized, and misunderstood. Some praised it as essential to a lady's appearance, while others condemned it as restrictive or even harmful. Yet despite controversy, the corset endured, defining not only fashion but culture, class, and identity in Victorian Britain. Tonight, in Boring History for Sleep, we will slowly and calmly explore this fascinating garment. We will trace its origins, its role in society, and the way it became both admired and contested. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can return again for more quiet journeys into the overlooked corners of history. In the long 19th century, when Britain stood at the height of its empire, when factories roared in the cities and steamships crossed the oceans, another quieter transformation was unfolding in drawing rooms, parlors, and sewing workshops. This was the transformation of the human figure, above all, the female figure, into a shape that expressed the ideals of Victorian culture. And at the heart of this transformation stood the corset. Victorian society placed great importance on appearances. The body itself was a canvas upon which ideals of morality, discipline, and respectability were drawn. Beauty was not merely an individual trait, but a reflection of character, class, and even national pride. To look proper was to be understood as upright, virtuous, and worthy of social standing. And the most visible symbol of this propriety was the silhouette created by the corset: a narrow waist, a lifted bust, and gently sloping shoulders. The corset's central role was no accident. For centuries, European fashion had emphasized shaping the body, but in the Victorian era this shaping became more codified, more universal, and more deeply tied to social meaning. The desired figure was not simply one of personal taste, it was a collective cultural standard. Women were measured, literally and figuratively, by how closely they conformed to it. The ideal silhouette of the Victorian woman combined fragility and control. The small waist suggested delicacy, yet it also symbolized discipline. To lace oneself into a corset each day was to demonstrate self-restraint and dedication to propriety. The body was not left to nature but ordered by culture, a sign of civilization itself. The corset thus became not only an item of clothing but a metaphor, the visible expression of an age that prized structure, restraint, and conformity. In portraits and fashion plates of the period, the ideal appears again and again. The wasp waist was emphasized by wide skirts, first through crinolines and later through bustles. Dresses were designed to contrast the narrow waist with broad hips and flowing fabric, making the corset's shaping power even more dramatic. Advertisements for corsets promised women elegance, grace, and the admiration of society. To wear one was not only fashionable, but essential for any woman wishing to move comfortably in polite circles. The social pressure to conform to this ideal was immense. For middle-class women, whose respectability was constantly under scrutiny, the corset was particularly important. It signaled propriety in a world where reputation could determine marriage prospects, employment, and social standing. Working-class women, too, often wore corsets, though their versions were sturdier, designed for labor as well as appearance. In every class, the corset was a marker of belonging, a garment that tied individuals to the expectations of their society. Yet the Victorian ideal of beauty was not static. It shifted subtly over the decades, reflecting broader cultural and economic changes. In the early Victorian period, the silhouette was long and modest, emphasizing smooth lines. By the mid-century, Crinolines expanded skirts to extraordinary widths, exaggerating the waist. Later, bustles added prominence to the back, altering proportions once more. Through it all, however, the corset remained constant, adapting its form but always shaping the waist as the centerpiece of beauty. The corset's power lay not only in shaping the body, but in shaping identity. To put on a corset each morning was to step into a role, that of a respectable Victorian woman, disciplined, elegant, and in harmony with the moral values of her age. Mothers passed this expectation to daughters, dressmakers reinforced it through craft, and society upheld it through praise or criticism. The ideal was not only worn, it was lived. There is, too, a deeper psychological element in this ideal. The corset created a sense of enclosure, a physical reminder of the boundaries of behavior. Women were expected to be modest, controlled, and orderly, and the corset's physical restriction mirrored these moral expectations. The body's posture, straight back, lifted head, restrained movements, was cultivated by the garment. In this sense, the Victorian ideal of beauty was inseparable from the Victorian ideal of behavior. Yet, even as it defined beauty, the corset also revealed contradictions. On the one hand, it was praised for elegance. On the other, criticized for harm. Doctors warned against tight lacing, claiming it deformed ribs, weakened lungs, and endangered health. Satirists mocked the extremes of fashion, depicting women fainting from too tight corsets. But even these criticisms acknowledged the corset's centrality. It was too important, too symbolic, to ignore. The persistence of the corset across the Victorian century demonstrates how deeply the ideal of beauty was embedded in culture. Women wore them not only because they wished to, but because they were expected to. A woman without a corset might be judged careless, unfashionable, or even morally suspect. To step outside the corseted ideal was to risk stepping outside respectability itself. When we look back today, the Victorian ideal of beauty may seem rigid, even harsh. Yet to contemporaries, it was a world of meaning, a way of aligning oneself with values of discipline, propriety, and refinement. The corset was not just fabric and whalebone. It was a social language, a statement written on the body. Thus, the Victorian ideal of beauty was defined not only by gowns or hairstyles, but by the corset that lay beneath. It was a beauty of order, of restraint, of conformity to cultural norms. And it was this beauty that set the stage for the debates, controversies, and adaptations that followed, as the corset continued to shape not only waists, but the very identity of Victorian Britain. To understand why corsets defined beauty in Victorian Britain, we need to step back into the past, long before Queen Victoria's reign, and trace the slow and layered evolution of this garment. The corset did not simply appear one morning in the 19th century as a finished creation. It was the product of centuries of change, refinement, and shifting ideas about the human body and its place in society. In every seam and every stitch of the Victorian corset was written a history that stretched back across generations, linking together ideals of beauty, morality, and discipline. The roots of the corset can be found in the late medieval and Renaissance worlds, when structured garments known as stays became central to women's fashion. Stays were stiffened bodices, often reinforced with materials such as reeds, hardened canvas, or even whalebone. They were laced tightly to the body, flattening the torso and forcing the wearer into a straight, upright posture. In portraits of 16th century noble women, we see their effect clearly: elongated bodies, smooth lines, and a commanding dignity that was as much moral as it was physical. Clothing in that age was not simply about covering the body, but about shaping it to reflect order and control, two values that dominated early modern culture. To wear stays was to embody discipline, restraint, and refinement. As the 17th century progressed, stays became more sophisticated. They extended lower over the hips, producing a cone-shaped figure that dominated European courts. These stays were often lavish, embroidered with silks, and sometimes designed to be glimpsed beneath gowns. They did not simply shape the body. They displayed wealth and social standing. A stiffened torso was both a fashion statement and a moral one, a way of presenting the body as upright in posture and upright in conduct. Even in this early form, the philosophy that would later define the Victorian corset was already present. The body was to be molded into an ideal, not left to nature. The 18th century brought further refinement. And here the corset began to take on a form recognizable to Victorians. Whalebone, or more precisely baleen, became the favored material for stiffening. Flexible yet strong, it allowed the creation of garments that could shape the waist and lift the bust while still permitting movement. The silhouette of the age emphasized small waists and rounded busts, and stays were essential to achieving it. Portraits of aristocratic women of the time show narrow waists emphasized by voluminous skirts and detailed bodices, the effect always dependent on what was worn beneath. Even outside the elite, stays became widespread. Working women often wore sturdier, simplified versions, for by then the stiffened bodice was associated with womanhood itself, a marker of propriety as well as beauty. But fashion is never fixed. And with the arrival of the French Revolution in 1789 came a sudden shift. In the revolutionary decades, the rigid stays of the aristocracy fell out of favor. High-waisted gowns inspired by classical antiquity became fashionable, their soft, flowing lines requiring little or no stiffened undergarment. For a time, the female body was allowed a freer, looser silhouette. This was not simply a matter of aesthetics, but of politics and symbolism. The abandonment of rigid stays was seen by some as the abandonment of the old order, of monarchy and hierarchy, in favor of something more natural. Yet the freedom of the revolution proved temporary. By the early 19th century, as Britain moved into the Regency era, the pendulum swung back. Structure returned, and with it, the corset. Women once again sought narrow waists and defined curves, though the corset of this period was lighter and more flexible than the heavy stays of earlier times. It was at this moment that the word corset came into widespread use, replacing the older term stays. The garment was beginning its transformation into the essential feature of 19th century fashion, by the time Victoria ascended the throne in 1837. The corset had taken on its fully recognizable form, a garment that laced at the back, stiffened with whalebone or steel, and sometimes fitted with a front bust to provide additional rigidity. It was no longer only the preserve of aristocrats or the wealthy, for the Industrial Revolution had changed the nature of production. With the rise of textile factories and mass manufacture, corsets became available to a broader range of women. In London, Manchester, and countless provincial towns, shops sold ready-made corsets in various sizes, while seamstresses continued to produce custom-fitted versions for wealthier clients. For the first time in history, women across classes could participate in the same basic fashion ideal. Even if the quality of materials and craftsmanship varied greatly, the symbolism of the corset, however, remained deeply rooted in its long history. It still carried the moral weight of the 16th century stays, suggesting discipline and uprightness. It still carried the aristocratic association of the 18th century, in which a narrow waist was a sign of refinement. And it still bore the tension introduced during the Revolutionary era between the freedom of a natural body and the order imposed by culture. The Victorian corset was, in effect, the heir to all these traditions. To lace one on was to step into a garment that carried with it centuries of cultural meaning. The corset in Victorian Britain was therefore more than a fashion accessory. It was a garment of continuity. It tied the present to the past, embodying the long European tradition of shaping the body into an ideal. It was both practical and symbolic, both fabric and philosophy. and though its form had changed, lighter than the stays of Elizabethan times, more accessible than the aristocratic stays of the 18th century, it remained constant in its purpose: to mold the body, to display beauty, and to communicate identity. When we look at the origins of the corset, we see clearly why it held such power in the Victorian imagination. It was not a novelty, but an inheritance, carrying forward ideas about beauty and discipline that had been centuries in the making. Every seam stitched by a stay maker, every strip of whalebone or steel inserted, every lace pulled tight was part of a story that stretched back through generations. The Victorian woman who stood before her mirror each morning, tightening her corset, was therefore not only preparing herself for the day. She was stepping into history itself, wearing on her body the legacy of hundreds of years of fashion, morality, and social expectation. The origins of the corset remind us that garments are never just garments. They are histories in cloth, traditions made tangible. And in the case of the corset, they are also symbols of beauty, of discipline, and of the unending dialogue between the natural body and the cultural ideal. By the 19th century, when the corset reigned supreme in Britain, it carried within it all these meanings, stitched together in whalebone and fabric, defining not only the shape of the body but the shape of society itself. To truly understand the corset's place in Victorian Britain, one must look closely not only at the women who wore it, but at the materials and craftsmanship that brought it into being. The corset was far more than a simple undergarment. It was the product of a world of skill, labor, and industry. Each seam, each strip of boning, each lace was part of a system that linked together global trade, industrial progress, and the patient work of seamstresses and staymakers. By examining how corsets were made, we see not only the physical construction of a garment, but the cultural and economic forces stitched into its very fabric. The materials that shaped the corset were as varied as they were symbolic. Chief among them was whalebone, or more precisely baleen, harvested from the mouths of whales. Baleen was prized for its unique qualities: flexible yet strong, capable of bending without breaking, and ideal for creating structure that could move with the body. For centuries, whalebone had been the backbone of corsetry, literally and figuratively. In the Victorian period, it was still widely used, though by the later decades steel would increasingly take its place. The reliance on whalebone tied the corset industry to the global whaling trade, linking fashionable London drawing rooms with distant oceans where whalers risked their lives to harvest the material. To wear a corset was, in an unseen way, to participate in this global network of labor and danger. Fabric was another vital component. Corsets were most often made of strong cotton, linen, or coutil, a tightly woven cloth designed to resist straying. Wealthier women might choose corsets made from silk, satin, or even velvet, often richly embroidered or trimmed with lace. For the working classes, sturdier fabrics were favored, practical, and durable, capable of withstanding daily wear. The choice of fabric reflected not only class, but intention. Some corsets were built for display, to be glimpsed beneath gowns, while others were designed to disappear, silent and unseen, beneath layers of clothing. Yet whether humble or luxurious, the fabric was always carefully chosen. For the corset's work was hard, and its materials had to endure the pressure of daily lacing. The introduction of steel transformed corset making. By the mid-19th century, steel busks, long, flat strips inserted at the front, gave the corset firmness and symmetry. Steel eyelets, too, replaced stitched holes, allowing laces to be pulled tighter without tearing. This marriage of fabric and metal was a symbol of the age. Just as the railways and factories were reshaping the world with iron and steam, so too did steel reshape the corset, making it more precise, more rigid, and in some ways more demanding. The corset was, in this sense, a garment of its industrial era, carrying the stamp of progress in every piece of hardware it contained. The craftsmanship that brought these materials together was considerable. Corsets were not casual items to be run off quickly. They required careful design, measurement, and construction. Staymakers and seamstresses measured clients with tapes, noted the curves of waist and bust, and drafted patterns suited to each body. The pieces of fabric were cut with precision, stitched into panels, and then reinforced with boning. Each strip of whalebone or steel was inserted into carefully sewn channels, stitched firmly to prevent movement. Busks were slotted into the front, lacing holes reinforced at the back, and strong cords threaded through. Finally, decorative touches, ribbons, lace, or embroidery were added, depending on the means of the wearer. The work of these artisans was often invisible, hidden beneath the gowns that women wore. Yet without their labor, the silhouette of the Victorian age would have been impossible. In small workshops in cities and towns, seamstresses bent over tables by lamplight, their needles and scissors shaping the very image of beauty. Many were poorly paid, working long hours to produce garments for wealthier clients. Their skill was rarely celebrated, yet their hands gave form to the ideals of the age. Corsetry also became increasingly industrialized. Factories produced ready-made corsets in standard sizes, making them available to a wider audience. Advances in sewing machines allowed faster production, though hand finishing was still required for quality. Shop windows in London, Manchester, and provincial towns displayed corsets of every size and price, and advertisements in newspapers promised elegance and comfort to women of all classes. Yet, even with mass production, the essence of craftsmanship remained. A poorly made corset could tear, bend, or fail to shape the body correctly. Quality was therefore prized, and the best corset makers retained reputations that drew clients from afar. The making of a corset was not only a matter of skill, but of knowledge. Staymakers understood anatomy, even if imperfectly. They knew how to distribute pressure, how to balance firmness with comfort, how to shape the waist without crushing the ribcage. Some advertised their products as hygienic or medically approved, claiming their designs supported the spine or aided posture. Others boasted of invisible corsets that shaped without showing, or indestructible models for hardware. Such claims reveal how corsetry straddled the line between fashion and function, between art and science. The symbolism of materials should not be overlooked. Whalebone connected the corset to the dangers of the sea and the power of empire. Cotton and linen spoke of industrial looms, of colonies, and of the vast trade networks that sustained Britain. Steel reflected modern progress, the triumph of industry. Even thread and ribbon carried meanings of class, wealth, and refinement. Every corset was thus a small summary of Victorian Britain itself, industrial, imperial, and deeply invested in appearance. For the wearer, the craftsmanship mattered profoundly. A well-made corset could provide not only the desired silhouette, but also a sense of security. It supported the back, improved posture, and, when fitted correctly, could be surprisingly comfortable. Women who wore corsets daily came to rely on the firmness they provided, the way the garment held the body steady. In this sense, the quality of craftsmanship shaped not only appearance but experience. A corset was both cage and comfort, restriction and support, depending on how it was made. The long hours of labor, the global networks of trade, the careful hands of seamstresses, all of these were hidden beneath the gowns of Victorian Britain. Yet they were always present, shaping the lives of those who wore and those who made corsets. To speak of Victorian beauty without acknowledging materials and craftsmanship is to miss the essential truth that every ideal of elegance rested on the shoulders, hands, and backs of those who constructed the garments. The corset was not only the story of women who wore them, but of those who stitched them, hammered the eyelets, cut the baleen, and wove the fabric. Thus, the materials and craftsmanship of the corset reveal its true nature. It was never a simple item of clothing, but a complex product of industry, artistry, and empire. Whalebone from the oceans, cotton from colonies, steel from factories, fabric from looms, all converged in the hands of skilled workers to produce a garment that defined beauty for an age. When a Victorian woman laced her corset each morning, she was not only shaping her own figure, she was binding herself into a garment that carried the work of countless unseen hands, the reach of global trade, and the very spirit of Victorian industry. In the end, the corset was both intimate and vast. Intimate in its closeness to the body, vast in the networks that produced it. Its materials tell the story of nature harnessed, industry advanced, and empire expanded. Its craftsmanship tells the story of skill, patience, and the quiet labor of thousands. Together, they explain why the corset was not only central to fashion, but central to the world that created it. The corset in Victorian Britain was more than an undergarment. It was a social marker. It told the world who you were, what you could afford, and how you wished to be seen. To speak of corsetry in this period is to speak not only of beauty, but of class. For the corset was worn differently, understood differently, and valued differently across the great social divisions of the 19th century. Its laces bound together not only fabric and bone, but also ideas of respectability, morality, and social rank. For the upper classes, the corset was an essential part of a broader display of wealth and refinement. Aristocratic women ordered corsets made of the finest fabrics, silk, satin, and brocade, decorated with lace and embroidery, trimmed with ribbons, and sometimes adorned with tiny pearl buttons. These were garments meant not only to shape the body, but also to be admired. In some gowns, the corset was designed to be glimpsed, its fabric coordinating with the dress itself. To own such corsets was to display both wealth and taste, for their cost was high and their craftsmanship intricate. For these women, the corset was less about necessity than about luxury, a garment that completed the ritual of dressing in elaborate gowns, layers of petticoats, and fine accessories. Servants assisted in the lacing, pulling tightly to achieve the fashionable wasp waist. For the elite, the corset symbolized leisure, the ability to wear a garment that restricted movement because one did not need to work with the body but could display it as a symbol of status. For the middle classes, the corset carried a different weight. It was not merely a fashionable item, but a moral one. In Victorian culture, respectability was the currency of the middle class, and the corset became one of its most visible tokens. To appear in public without the defined waist that a corset provided was to risk judgment as careless, unladylike, or even morally suspect. Middle-class women, aware that reputation shaped their family's position, embraced corsets as symbols of propriety. Their corsets were often made of strong cotton or coutil, plain in color but sturdy in function, providing the silhouette that society demanded without extravagant decoration. In shop advertisements, corsets were promoted to the middle class as healthy, supportive, and elegant, promising not only beauty but discipline. A properly laced corset signaled that a woman was diligent, controlled, and attentive to the codes of her class. For working-class women, corsetry presented both a challenge and a necessity. These women worked long hours in factories, fields, and households, yet even in these contexts, the corset was often worn. To appear without it was to risk being seen as slovenly or improper. For corsetry had become so deeply tied to femininity that even women who labored with their hands were expected to shape their bodies according to fashion. Yet their corsets differed in material and design. They were sturdier, made of heavy cotton or linen, reinforced not with costly whalebone, but with cord or lighter steels. They were practical, built to withstand movement and strain. Some working women loosened their laces during labor, tightening them again afterward. Others owned only one corset, worn daily until worn out. For them, The corset was both a burden and a badge of respectability, a way of conforming to social norms even while struggling under economic necessity. The symbolic meanings of corsetry were therefore layered. In upper-class parlors, a delicate silk corset signified wealth and fashion. In middle-class drawing rooms, a firm cotton corset signified morality and propriety. In working-class homes, a well-worn corset signified dignity, the determination to maintain standards despite hardship. Across all classes, the corset communicated belonging. To wear one was to affirm that you were part of society, that you respected its ideals of discipline and order. To go without was to risk exclusion, criticism, or gossip. This class-bound nature of the corset was visible even in the shops that sold them. Elite women visited fashionable London establishments, where corsets were displayed like treasures, fitted carefully by skilled stainmakers. Middle-class women purchased theirs from drapers or ordered from catalogs, choosing sturdy but affordable models. Working-class women often relied on second-hand garments, hand-me-downs, or cheaper factory-made corsets, less elegant but sufficient to maintain the desired silhouette. The very place of purchase, the quality of fabric, and the degree of decoration all spoke volumes about social class. Yet despite these differences, there was also unity. In every class, the corset was present, binding women into a common silhouette. The narrow waist, whether wrapped in silk or in sturdy cotton, became a shared language across Britain, uniting women in a single vision of beauty even as it divided them by wealth and opportunity. It was one of the rare garments that transcended class, shaping the bodies of queens and factory workers alike at the same time. The corset could expose the tensions of class. Reformers who criticized tight lacing often noted that the poor suffered most, for their bodies bore the double strain of corsetry and hard labor. Satirists mocked the extravagance of upper-class fashions, pointing out that the delicate corsets of the wealthy were worlds apart from the practical stays of the poor. Yet these criticisms only underline how central the corset was to all classes. It was too important to ignore, too universal to dismiss. Corsetry also highlighted the ways class shaped ideas of femininity. For the elite, femininity was about display and leisure. For the middle classes, it was about morality and order. For the working poor, it was about respectability in the face of struggle. In each case, the corset gave physical form to these ideals, making visible the invisible expectations of class and gender that in the end. The corset in Victorian Britain was a garment of paradox. It divided classes by quality and cost, yet united them by silhouette and symbolism. It was worn in palaces and in slums, in parlors and in factories. It expressed wealth, morality, and dignity, depending on who wore it and how. And in every case, it revealed the deep entanglement of beauty with class, showing how the ideals of an age were stitched not only into gowns and fashions, but into the very shape of the human body. To imagine life in Victorian Britain without the corset is almost impossible, for it was not only a garment, but a constant companion, worn by women of nearly every class and age from morning until night. The corset shaped not only the body but the rhythm of the day, dictating how women moved, worked, and even rested. To live in Victorian Britain was, for most women, to live laced, bound, and supported by this ever-present garment. Examining daily life in a corset reveals not only how it was worn, but how it shaped experience, identity, and the very sense of self. The day usually began with the ritual of dressing, and at the center of this ritual was the corset. A woman did not simply slip it on. It required care, patience, and often the assistance of another. The garment was wrapped around the torso, its busk fastened at the front, and its long laces pulled tight at the back. For the wealthy, a maid performed this task, tightening the laces gradually, drawing the waist inward with practiced hands. For the middle and working classes, The process was often managed alone or with the help of a sister or mother, requiring twisting, tugging, and determination to achieve the proper fit. However it was done, the act of lacing was as symbolic as it was practical. It marked the transition from the intimacy of home to the propriety of public life. From the private body to the socially acceptable figure, once laced. The corset imposed itself upon every action. It straightened the back, lifted the bust, and restricted the waist. Posture became upright, movements controlled, gestures measured. A woman sitting in her parlor held herself differently in a corset than she would without one. The garment encouraged grace, stillness, and refinement. Even walking was shaped by the corset, which altered the swing of the hips and the rhythm of steps. For many, this was not experienced as restriction, but as habit. For women who had worn corsets since girlhood often felt incomplete without their support. The experience of wearing a corset varied according to class and circumstance. For the wealthy, daily life in a corset was bound up with leisure. Their corsets were finely made, often padded or lined for comfort, and worn beneath layers of silk gowns. These women did not labor physically, and so their corsets could be tighter, more decorative, and less concerned with durability. Their days were spent receiving visitors, attending social functions, or walking in gardens, all of which displayed the elegance of the corseted form. For them, the corset was as much a symbol of luxury as of fashion. For middle-class women, the corset was a symbol of propriety, worn even in the routines of household management. These women oversaw servants, cared for children, wrote letters, and visited neighbors, all while laced into sturdy cotton corsets. Their garments were practical yet firm, providing both the silhouette demanded by society and the physical support required for a day that might include long hours of activity. The corset, for them, was both shield and uniform, enabling them to present themselves with the respectability their class demanded. For working-class women, daily life in a corset was more demanding. Factory workers, shop girls, and servants wore corsets as well, though theirs were simpler and built for durability. These corsets had to endure strain, sweat, and long hours of movement. Some loosened their laces while working, tightening them again afterward, balancing comfort with respectability. A maid might scrub floors or carry heavy trays in a sturdy corset, while a seamstress bent over her table with her waist cinched just enough to maintain propriety, but not so tightly as to hinder her breathing. For them, the corset was not only a social necessity, but a physical burden, one that weighed upon tired backs and rubbed against weary ribs, yet still remained an indispensable part of life. Children, too, were introduced to corsets at a young age. Girls as young as 10 might begin wearing lightly boned stays to encourage proper posture and to prepare them for the full corsets of adolescence. This practice ensured that by the time a woman reached adulthood, the corset felt natural, even essential. The body itself adjusted to its daily presence, shaping habits of movement and posture that could last a lifetime. For many Victorian women, the corset was not an intrusion upon the body but a second skin, a garment so habitual that to go without felt almost indecent. Corsets also shaped how women experienced rest. At night, some removed them entirely, allowing the body freedom after long hours of restraint. Others, however, wore looser night stays, designed to provide gentle support even in sleep. The debate over whether to sleep in corsets reflected broader concerns about health and beauty. Advocates argued that constant support was necessary for maintaining the figure, while critics insisted that the body needed relief. Whichever choice was made, the presence or absence of the corset remained central, even in the most private hours of the day. The corset's influence extended into moments of strain and celebration alike. Women wore corsets during pregnancy, with special maternity designs created to provide support while accommodating growth. They wore them at weddings, the laces drawn tight to emphasize the slenderness of the bride. They wore them in mourning, black fabric replacing white, yet always shaping the same silhouette. From cradle to grave, the corset accompanied the Victorian woman, marking every stage of life. Daily life in a corset was not without discomfort. Many women complained of difficulty breathing when laced too tightly, of bruised ribs or sore muscles, of faintness in hot weather. Yet many others defended the garment, insisting that when properly fitted, a corset was supportive rather than restrictive. Doctors and reformers argued back and forth, but the reality remained that millions of women chose to lace themselves each day. For them, the corset was not a cruel device, but an ordinary necessity. Part of life as natural as shoes or gloves. In truth, the corset was more than clothing. It was a discipline. It reminded the wearer of society's expectations, shaping both body and behavior. To be laced was to be proper. To be unlaced was to be vulnerable. It was a daily negotiation between comfort and conformity, between self and society. And in this negotiation lay the essence of Victorian womanhood, defined not only by what was seen, but by what was felt beneath the gown. Thus, daily life in a corset was a life lived within boundaries, both physical and social. It was a life where beauty was shaped by fabric and bone, where respectability was measured in inches of waist, where every breath and gesture was subtly guided by the garment beneath. Whether rich or poor, young or old, the Victorian woman carried the corset with her through every hour of her day, from the moment she rose to the moment she lay down again. And in carrying it, she carried the ideals of her age, stitched tightly around her body, as constant and unyielding as the laces drawn each morning. The corset in Victorian Britain was never just a garment of fashion. It was also an object of controversy, the subject of heated discussions in parlors, lecture halls, and medical journals. To wear a corset was to make a statement not only about beauty, but about health, morality, and even the progress of society itself. Throughout the 19th century, doctors, reformers, and social critics argued over its effects, weighing its supposed benefits against its undeniable strains. In doing so, they revealed as much about the anxieties of their age as about the garment itself. Medical opinion in the Victorian period was far from united. Some doctors condemned the corset as dangerous, warning that tight lacing, the practice of pulling the waist to its narrowest possible size, compressed the ribs, displaced organs, and restricted breathing. Medical illustrations of the time showed skeletons with distorted rib cages, claiming these deformations were the result of years spent in tightly laced corsets. Critics pointed to fainting spells, shortness of breath, and digestive troubles as evidence that the corset was slowly harming women's health. To them, the garment symbolized vanity carried to extremes, beauty pursued at the expense of life itself. Yet other physicians defended the corset, insisting that when properly fitted and moderately laced, it could provide valuable support. They argued that corsets improved posture, supported the spine, and even aided women during pregnancy by lifting and supporting the abdomen. Some doctors prescribed corsets for women suffering from back pain, spinal weakness, or what they termed female complaints. Medical corsets, often advertised as hygienic or orthopedic, promised the benefits of fashion without the risks of tight lacing. These garments reveal how blurred the line between medicine and fashion could be, as health and beauty were often treated as two sides of the same coin. The debate over corsetry was not confined to doctors. Reformers of the Victorian dress reform movement seized upon the corset as a symbol of all that was wrong with women's fashion. They condemned it as an instrument of oppression, a device that bound women physically as society bound them socially. To them, the corset was a cage, restricting movement, impairing health, and perpetuating ideals that reduced women to ornamental figures rather than active participants in society. Pamphlets, lectures, and articles railed against the corset, urging women to abandon it in favor of looser, more natural clothing. The language was often passionate, painting the corset not just as a garment, but as a chain that needed to be broken at the same time. Defenders of the corset saw it as a symbol of propriety and civilization. They argued that beauty required discipline, that the body must be shaped to reflect moral order. To discard the corset, they feared, would be to invite disorder, both in fashion and in society. Respectable women, they insisted, must present themselves in the proper silhouette, for appearance was a reflection of character. The corset thus became a battlefield between tradition and reform, between restraint and freedom, between conformity and individuality. The public debate was carried into the press. Newspapers and magazines published articles and letters for and against the corset. Fashion periodicals praised new designs as lighter, healthier, and more comfortable, while reformist journals condemned them as traps. Satirical cartoons depicted women fainting dramatically, their waists squeezed impossibly small, or men tightening the laces of their wives with exaggerated zeal. These images both mocked and reinforced the centrality of the corset, for satire thrives only on what is already important. For women themselves, the medical and moral debates often felt distant. Many continued to wear corsets because they were simply part of life, as ordinary as stockings or shoes. They knew the discomforts, shortness of breath when climbing stairs, soreness after long hours of wear. But they also knew the benefits, the support, the improved posture, the sense of elegance. For most women, the corset was not an object of debate but a necessity, something worn without daily questioning. The arguments of doctors and reformers may have stirred public opinion, but they rarely altered personal practice. Nevertheless, the medical debate had lasting influence. It raised awareness of the risks of extreme tight lacing, encouraging moderation in some circles. It inspired the creation of health corsets, designed to distribute pressure more evenly and reduce harm. It also laid the groundwork for later reform movements that would challenge restrictive clothing altogether. In this sense, the debate over the corset was part of a broader conversation about the role of women in society, their health, their rights, and their freedom. The controversy also reflected the tensions of the Victorian age itself. This was a society caught between tradition and change, between industrial progress and moral restraint. The corset embodied these tensions perfectly. It was modern in its materials, steel, cotton, mass-produced fabrics, yet ancient in its symbolism of restraint. It was criticized as harmful, yet defended as essential. It was loved, hated, feared, and desired, often all at once. That in the end, the medical and social debates did not end the reign of the corset in Victorian Britain. Women continued to lace themselves each day, shaping their bodies to meet the expectations of their world. But the debates left a mark, planting questions that would grow in the decades to come. Was beauty worth the price of health? Was propriety worth the price of freedom? And could women redefine beauty on their own terms? These questions lingered, carried forward into the 20th century, as the corset slowly gave way to new fashions and new ideals. Yet in the Victorian era, the debate itself was as important as the garment. For in arguing about the corset, Victorians were really arguing about much more, about the place of women in society, about the balance between body and culture, and about the eternal conflict between the natural and the constructed. Thus, the story of medicine and debate is not only about bones and fabric, but about ideas. The corset, in all its controversy, was a mirror in which Victorians saw reflected their hopes, fears, and contradictions. And in that mirror, tightly laced, we can still glimpse the struggles of an age trying to reconcile beauty with health, discipline with freedom, and tradition with change. To understand the corset in Victorian Britain, one must not view it only as an undergarment hidden beneath layers of fabric, but as the very foundation upon which all of fashion and society rested. The corset shaped not only the body but the garments that clothed it, the social rituals that surrounded it, and the cultural values it embodied. To speak of Victorian fashion is, in truth, to speak of the corset, for every gown, every bodice, and every carefully chosen accessory was designed with its presence in mind. The corset was not simply worn beneath fashion. It was the architecture upon which fashion itself was built. The silhouette of the Victorian woman was defined by the corset. The narrow waist it produced provided the central line around which the rest of the dress was arranged. In the early years of Victoria's reign, wide crinolines expanded skirts to dramatic proportions, their volume emphasizing the contrast with the tightly laced waist above. Later, in the bustle era, the corset helped to tilt the figure forward, thrusting the hips back to accommodate elaborate structures at the rear of the dress. At every stage, the corset was indispensable. It created the shape, and the fashions of the day magnified it. A gown without a corset would hang awkwardly, its lines collapsing without the firm foundation the corset provided. Corsets did more than shape the body. They shaped the social rituals of dress. The act of lacing was itself a performance, often requiring the assistance of another. For the wealthy, a lady's maid drew the laces tight, transforming her mistress's body into the silhouette demanded by fashion. For the middle classes, mothers and daughters laced one another, sharing the daily ritual that reinforced bonds of family and conformity. Even for the working classes, the act of pulling laces tight before stepping out into the world was a gesture of respectability, a declaration that despite hardship, they too conformed to the ideals of the age. Fashion magazines and advertisements reinforced the centrality of corsetry. Ladies leafed through the pages of publications like the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine and saw endless illustrations of gowns whose beauty depended on the corseted waist. Advertisements promised corsets that were both stylish and healthful, offering the latest innovations: lighter fabrics, steel busks, improved lacing systems. They promised not only beauty but social success. To wear the right corset was to be admired, to be accepted, to belong. In this sense, the corset was marketed not just as clothing, but as a gateway into society itself. The corset also influenced how women moved through social spaces. A woman entering a ballroom did so with a posture defined by her corset, shoulders back, waist cinched, bosom lifted. Her movements, whether walking, dancing, or sitting, were framed by the garment beneath. To observers, her grace was a reflection of her refinement, her ability to embody the ideals of her class and her culture. At teas, in parlors, at concerts and theaters, the corseted figure became the standard of femininity, admired, scrutinized, and imitated. The symbolism of corsetry in society was profound. To wear a corset was to declare discipline and control, both personal and social. A woman whose waist was properly laced demonstrated not only beauty but moral uprightness. For in Victorian thinking, the physical body was a mirror of the moral self. Respectable society demanded not only that women behave properly, but that they look proper, and the corset was the most visible guarantee of this propriety. In this way, fashion and morality were bound together by the garment's laces. Yet the corset also reflected and reinforced the divisions of society. For the wealthy, corsets were ornate, made of silk or satin, adorned with lace, and designed to be glimpsed in moments of intimacy or leisure. For the middle classes, corsets were plainer but no less essential, markers of propriety that spoke of diligence and respectability. For the working poor, corsets were practical, often secondhand, sometimes worn until threadbare, but still necessary to maintain the appearance demanded by society. The corset was thus one of the rare garments worn across all classes, yet always differently, always in ways that revealed the wearer's place in the hierarchy of Victorian life at the same time. The corset was tied to debates about progress and modernity. Some saw it as a triumph of civilization, a garment that disciplined the body and elevated appearance to a higher standard. Others saw it as a relic of repression, a reminder of society's desire to control women's bodies and movements. These debates spilled over into literature, satire, and public discourse, ensuring that the corset was never merely silent fabric, but always a subject of thought and contention. Even men were touched by the culture of corsetry. Though they did not wear corsets in the same widespread way as women, some fashionable men adopted light stays to improve posture and slim the waist beneath tailored coats. More importantly, men were the viewers, critics, and often enforcers of corseted beauty, whether as husbands, fathers, or members of society at large. The corset was thus not only a women's garment, but part of a larger system of expectations in which men played their part, shaping ideals of femininity through praise, satire, or disapproval. The connection between corsets, fashion, and society endured across the entire Victorian century. Fashions changed. Crinolines gave way to bustles, sleeves swelled and shrank, skirts widened and narrowed, but the corset remained. It was the constant thread, the invisible architecture that underpinned every style. Without the corset, Victorian fashion would have collapsed. Without fashion, the corset would have lost its meaning. Together, they formed a perfect pair, each defining and reinforcing the other. In the end, the corset was not just part of Victorian fashion. It was Victorian fashion. It dictated the silhouette of the age, it defined respectability, and it marked class. It was present in every gown, every social ritual, every public appearance. To wear it was to belong. To neglect it was to risk exclusion. And in this way, the corset became not only the foundation of a dress, but the foundation of society's vision of beauty itself. In Victorian Britain, the corset was never only about fashion. It was also a symbol, one so powerful and so deeply embedded in the culture of the age that it shaped how women were perceived not only in drawing rooms and ballrooms, but in every corner of society. To understand the corset as a symbol of respectability is to see how fabric, bone, and steel came to embody ideals of morality, discipline, and social order. It is to understand how a garment worn close to the skin could nevertheless carry enormous weight in the public imagination, speaking silently yet eloquently about who a woman was and how she wished to be judged. The Victorian age was obsessed with respectability. This was not merely a personal virtue, but a public necessity. A family's standing depended on appearances, and appearances were scrutinized constantly by neighbors, acquaintances, and strangers alike. Respectability was about morality, about orderliness, about self-control. It was about being seen to live a proper life, to embody the values of one's class and community. For women, the corset became one of the most visible signs of this respectability. A well-laced waist, supported and controlled, spoke of a woman's discipline, her attention to propriety, and her acceptance of her role in society. The corset's symbolism was reinforced by its physical effects. To wear it was to shape the body into a disciplined form, shoulders straight, posture upright, waist narrow, movements measured. The corset trained the body in the same way that society trained the mind, imposing restraint and order. A woman who wore her corset faithfully was understood to be modest, respectable, and moral. A woman who neglected it risked being judged careless, slovenly, or even suspect in character. Thus, the garment became not only a matter of fashion but a test of virtue, a daily performance of discipline visible to all. For the middle classes in particular, the corset was indispensable. This was the class most concerned with appearances, for their position was not secured by aristocratic heritage but earned through work, reputation, and social standing. The corset became their uniform of propriety, the garment that proved their respectability to the world. A middle-class woman who appeared in public without the clear lines of a corseted waist would invite whispers and disapproval, no matter how modest her behavior. Respectability was judged at first sight, and the corset provided the silhouette that reassured society. The symbolism extended to other classes as well. For the wealthy, the corset was a sign of refinement and elegance, proof that they had the leisure to shape their bodies into fashionable forms. For the working poor, it was a sign of dignity, a refusal to surrender respectability even in the face of hardship. Even a worn or second-hand corset, laced each morning, was a statement. I belong, I conform, I respect the codes of my society. In this way, the corset united classes under a common symbol, even as the quality and decoration of the garment revealed differences of wealth. The corset also became entangled with morality in a broader sense. Preachers, writers, and moralists often spoke of the importance of modesty and discipline, and the corset seemed to embody these virtues physically. Its constriction suggested control over bodily impulses. Its shaping of the figure suggested modest concealment beneath layers of fabric. Even when critics accused it of vanity or harm, defenders insisted that it was essential to maintaining standards of propriety. To abandon the corset was, in their view, to risk abandoning the moral fabric of society itself. This symbolic power was reinforced through the culture of the day. Fashion magazines emphasized not only the elegance but the respectability of corsets, describing them as indispensable for any lady of refinement. Advertisements promised models that were elegant yet modest, stylish yet proper. Satirical cartoons mocked women who laced too tightly, but in doing so they acknowledged the inevitability of the corset as a marker of respectability. Even debates over health and reform never truly dislodged its symbolic role, for to question the corset was to question the very structure of Victorian society. The symbolism of respectability was also gendered. For men, respectability was often displayed through clothing that suggested work, sobriety, and reliability, dark suits, simple lines, restrained styles. For women, respectability was bound to the body itself, shaped and disciplined by the corset. A man might show his character through his conduct. A woman was expected to show hers through her silhouette. This double standard reinforced the corset's power, for it made women's bodies the stage upon which morality and propriety were displayed. For many women, the corset became inseparable from identity. To lace oneself each morning was not only to prepare for the day, but to step into the role society demanded. To remove the corset was to retreat into privacy, into the unobserved self. In this sense, the corset was both armor and uniform, a garment that equipped women for the public gaze. The respectability it signified was not always freely chosen, but it was always necessary. For to neglect it was to risk exclusion from the very fabric of Victorian society at the same time. The corset could be experienced with pride. Many women felt that their corsets gave them poise, elegance, and a sense of self-respect. They valued the way it shaped their appearance, the way it distinguished them from the careless or the immodest. Respectability was a burden, but it was also a badge of honor, and the corset was its most visible form. Women wore them not only out of fear of judgment, but also out of a genuine desire to embody the ideals of their time, that in the end, the corset's symbolism as respectability endured throughout the Victorian age. It was reinforced by fashion, by morality, by class, and by daily habit. It shaped not only the body but the meaning of the body, turning fabric and bone into a language understood by all. To wear a corset was to speak that language fluently, to declare oneself respectable, disciplined, and proper. To neglect it was to risk speaking out of turn, to risk silence, suspicion, or exclusion. Thus, the corset was not only a garment of beauty but a garment of meaning. It was the visible line between propriety and impropriety, between inclusion and exclusion, between the disciplined self and the unshaped body. In Victorian Britain, respectability was everything, and the corset was its most enduring symbol. Although the corset defined beauty and respectability in Victorian Britain, it was never without its challengers. For as long as women tightened their waists with laces, there were voices that questioned, criticized, and resisted. Some objected on medical grounds, warning of harm to the body. Others objected on moral grounds, arguing that fashion enslaved women rather than liberated them. Still others sought reform not because they wished to abolish the corset entirely, but because they wanted to reshape its use into something more humane and rational. The story of resistance and reform reveals that even at the height of its power, the corset was not universally accepted, but contested, debated, and reimagined. The medical criticisms were some of the loudest. Doctors who studied the effects of tight lacing warned that constant pressure on the ribs and abdomen displaced organs, compressed lungs, and led to fainting spells. Illustrations circulated showing rib cages bent inward, stomachs pressed downward, and spines distorted by years of lacing. These images, reproduced in pamphlets and medical lectures, created a powerful visual argument against the extremes of fashion. The fainting woman, so often caricatured in literature and art, became the emblem of medical resistance to corsetry. Reformers seized upon such images to argue that fashion was not merely uncomfortable but actively dangerous. Reducing women's health and vitality for the sake of appearances, social reformers added another layer of criticism. They argued that corsets symbolized women's subjugation, a physical representation of society's desire to control their bodies and limit their freedom. To these critics, the corset was not simply a garment, but a cage, training women to be passive, ornamental, and dependent. Reformers associated with the emerging women's rights movement saw the corset as one more barrier to education, work, and independence. How? They asked. Could women take their place in the modern world if their bodies were bound by steel and whalebone? In their speeches and writings, the corset became shorthand for all the restrictions imposed upon women by Victorian society. Yet resistance was not limited to words. In the mid-19th century, the dress reform movement emerged, advocating looser, more natural clothing. Reformers promoted health corsets that reduced pressure on the waist, or gowns that could be worn without corsets altogether. They experimented with garments like the reform dress, which replaced layers of petticoats and tightly laced waists with simpler, freer designs. These efforts met with limited success, for society was slow to embrace such changes. But they represented an important step toward questioning the inevitability of the corset. Not all reformers sought abolition. Many believed the corset could be improved rather than discarded. Manufacturers responded with innovations. Corsets designed to distribute pressure more evenly, models advertised as ventilated for better airflow, or those with elastic panels that allowed greater comfort. Some corsets were marketed as orthopedic, recommended by doctors for posture and back support. These health-focused designs reveal that even critics acknowledged the garment's entrenchment in society. Rather than overthrow the corset, many sought to tame it, to make it less harmful while preserving its social and aesthetic functions. Resistance also found expression in satire and popular culture. Cartoons mocked women who laced too tightly, depicting them with impossibly tiny waists or fainting dramatically at social events. Such humor carried an edge of criticism, exposing the absurdity of fashion taken to extremes. Novels and plays, too, sometimes portrayed corsetry as a symbol of vanity, highlighting the tension between natural health and artificial beauty. These cultural expressions kept the debate alive, ensuring that corsetry was never simply accepted but always subject to scrutiny and laughter at the same time. Many women themselves engaged in quiet forms of resistance. Some loosened their laces when away from public eyes, allowing their bodies relief in private. Others chose lighter corsets or wore them less tightly than fashion demanded. For working women, necessity often forced compromise, as their daily labor could not be reconciled with extreme tight lacing. These everyday acts of moderation were themselves forms of resistance, subtle yet meaningful, showing that women were not passive victims of fashion but active participants negotiating between ideals and realities. By the late 19th century, as new ideas about women's health, education, and independence spread, resistance gained strength. The suffrage movement, though primarily political, shared with dress reform a desire to free women from restrictions, both social and physical. The image of the corset as a symbol of oppression became increasingly powerful, linking debates about clothing with debates about freedom itself. By the dawn of the 20th century, this resistance contributed to the gradual decline of the corset. As new fashions embraced looser silhouettes and new undergarments replaced the rigid structures of the past. Yet, even as resistance grew, reform was often cautious, acknowledging the corset's deep entrenchment in culture. Many reformers wore corsets themselves, albeit more loosely, understanding that to abandon them entirely was socially risky. The corset was so bound up with respectability that rejection could mean exclusion. Reform was therefore gradual, negotiated, and complex, shaped by both critique and compromise. In the end, the story of resistance and reform reveals the paradox of the corset in Victorian Britain. It was both fiercely defended and passionately criticized, both indispensable and condemned. Its opponents argued from medicine, morality, and freedom, while its defenders argued from propriety, beauty, and tradition. Between them lay countless women navigating their own choices, resisting in small ways, reforming in others, but always living within the realities of their age. The corset did not fall overnight. It persisted, adapted, and endured, even as resistance gathered strength. But the voices of reform left a lasting mark, shaping not only the future of fashion but the future of women's place in society. For in questioning the corset, Victorians were questioning much more: the control of bodies, the definition of beauty, and the boundaries of freedom itself. The story of the Victorian corset is, in truth, the story of an age. It was a garment worn close to the body, yet it carried meanings that stretched far beyond fabric and bone. It defined beauty, expressed class, enforced propriety, and invited both devotion and resistance. It shaped not only the silhouette of millions of women, but also the values of a society that prized order, discipline, and respectability. For some, the corset was comfort, supportive, reliable, even elegant. For others, it was restriction, an emblem of control, of society's demand that women discipline themselves into an ideal. For reformers, it was a symbol of oppression. For fashion lovers, it was the key to grace. And for historians, it remains a paradox, a garment both praised and condemned, endured and abandoned, remembered with fascination long after its era ended. The corset's true legacy lies in this complexity. It was never one thing, never one story. It was many stories stitched together, as varied as the women who wore it and the critics who resisted it. To look at a corset in a museum today is to see not only the whalebone and steel, the stitches and laces, but also the invisible weight of history, the daily rituals, the whispered judgments, the debates and defenses that surrounded it. When we speak of the corset now, we speak not only of the Victorian age, but of ourselves. We recognize in it the enduring tension between beauty and comfort, between individuality and conformity, between the natural body and the shaped body. These tensions are not confined to the 19th century. They live on in our own world, in new forms, in new fashions, in new debates. The corset reminds us that clothing has always been more than clothing. It has always been meaning, memory, and message. As we close this calm journey into the world of Victorian fashion, let us remember the women who rose each morning to lace their waists, who carried the weight of respectability with each breath, who moved with elegance because society demanded it, and who, in countless quiet ways, negotiated between the demands of fashion and the realities of life. Their corsets were their companions, their burdens, their comforts, and their symbols. And in their stories, we find a reflection of the Victorian age itself, disciplined, complex, contradictory, and endlessly fascinating. Thank you for joining Boring History for Sleep. If you enjoyed this quiet exploration, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can return again for more gentle journeys into the hidden corners of history. Good night.